Dame and to our inaugural death penalty abolition week. We're delighted to host this important discussion and to welcome one of the most powerful Catholic voices in the debate, Dr. Syl Schieber. Anyone who has spent any time in any Catholic school, elementary school, middle school, high school, college, or a Catholic law school like this must realize that they've spent time face to face with the violence, brutality, indignity, and inhumanity of the death penalty. It is clearly depicted on the wall of every classroom in every Catholic school in the world. It is depicted in this classroom in the form of that crucifix on the wall. Our Lord Jesus Christ was a victim of the death penalty. Every time we look at that cross, we should be reminded by the blood dripping from his hands, his feet, his side, and his head of just how violent we can be even to the Son of God and any child of God. In 2018, Pope Francis changed number 2267 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church to clearly articulate our united opposition to the death penalty. That catechism number states that recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. Today, however, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of a very serious crime. In addition, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. Lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time, do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. Consequently, the Church teaches, in the light of the gospel, that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. And she works with the determination for its abolition worldwide. As Catholics, Christians, and human beings, we have an obligation to see each and every person as created in the likeness and image of God. As Jesus himself commanded us in Matthew 25:40, we are to see the face of Christ in every person upon whom we cast our gaze. And so I'm proud that Notre Dame Law School stands with our church and with Syl Schieber in following the command of Christ to fight for the abolition of the death penalty and to recognize the human dignity of every human life as created in the likeness and image of God. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Cole, for those very enlightening remarks and welcoming remarks, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us here today. So I have the opportunity to welcome our very special guest here today, and that's Syl Schieber and his wife, Vicki, that have both come to join us here today. It's really interesting. You know, there are a number of arguments that I think very powerful arguments that are made in opposition to the death penalty. And many of those arguments we have discussed over the last 2 days and will continue to discuss today and tomorrow during Death Penalty Abolition Week. But interestingly, one of the arguments that's been advanced in favor of, in support of the death penalty, is that its retributive purpose is actually being served with respect to the relatives, the family, the surviving family members of the victim. And Justice Breyer, in a concurring decision in Glossop versus Gross, a U.S. Supreme Court decision decided in 2015, stated, and I quote, he referred to the retributive purpose of the death penalty as a vindication for the, quote, surviving relatives of victims of a horrendous crime or perhaps the community itself, end quote. So this is a kind of recent development, recent argument in support of the death penalty. It's really for the benefit of the victims. The victims are being honored, the victims' needs are being addressed here. It's been referred to as a kind of a victim service program. The death penalty is a victim service program for the victims of the murder that justified the capital punishment. So in essence, it's been argued as not revenge, but really closure. That it's somehow aiding this closure. It's aiding the family in coming to some conclusion and closure with respect to the death penalty. And so it poses this very important question, and that is, does the death penalty in fact serve survivors' interests? And here today, we're going to hear from Syl Schieber in just a moment, and I think he has a different perspective on the issue. And in addition, he has a very important, compelling story to share with us today. And for me, the way that I look at it is not only is it a story about the tragic, brutal, horrible murder of their daughter, Shannon, in 1998, but I think at the same time, on a more positive note, it's a story about enormous religious faith and the strength of the Schiebers' moral convictions and beliefs. In essence, it is faith in action. Taking your faith and not just repeating the words of the gospel, but living those words in your daily life and speaking out in favor of the words of the gospel. And so with that, please join me in welcoming our very special guest back to Notre Dame, because of course he's a double domer. And Mr. Schieber, welcome back to Notre Dame.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Dean Cole for coming out and with those very kind opening, meaningful opening remarks. Also, Professor Garuli for putting together this program and for the university and the law school to begin to focus on this issue in a major way. The church took a long time to get to the point that it's now at in the catechism, and that there's many members of the flock that haven't quite caught up with the modern developments. I'm going to start off with a little bit of background on Shannon. She was born on the 8th day of August in 1974. For those of you who remember Dick Dixon's resignation, it was the day that he announced that he was going to resign from the presidency. The next day he actually resigned, and it also coincided with the day that I was awarded my Ph.D. from Our Lady's University. So it was kind of a momentous time in our family. She's an extremely bright young woman, and we experienced that early on. By the time she was in high school, she was president of the student body in her senior year at Bethesda Chevy Chase High School. At that time, a school of around 1,300 students. She ended up going to Duke University instead of Notre Dame. That's a long story, but she graduated from Duke in 3 years with a triple major, mathematics, economics, and philosophy. She was more than just an academic nerd. She was also co-captain of the equestrian team in her last year there. She also had quite quite a heart and soul about her. At memorial at Wharton after her death, a friend of hers, Martin Halleck, one of her classmates, said of Shannon, and I'm quoting, "Shortly before she died, we'd agreed we would go to Mass together one Sunday morning. As I waited for her on the front steps of the church, she came walking up with a very elderly gentleman. She had met him the prior afternoon when she encountered him near her apartment, struggling to get his groceries home. She offered to help him with his shopping bags, and as she did, he explained his wife of many years had recently died, and he was having a hard time dealing with all of that. So she invited him to join them for Mass the next morning, and then to accompany them to breakfast afterwards. After Martin's comments, he was followed by Sister Denise Malika from West Philadelphia Catholic High School. It's an inner city minority high school where Shannon had gone in the fall of 1997 as she was entering grad school there in Philadelphia. She had gone over and offered to teach a financial literacy course for these inner city students, teaching them about stocks and bonds and bank accounts and doing budgets and those kinds of things, and helped set up a little mock company for a school project in the second semester. And she was supposed to be in attendance at a special reception the students were going to have her on the evening of May the 7th of 1998. But she was killed around 2 o'clock that morning, so she failed to attend. In her last communication with me, I had written her about kind of her potential contributions in the areas she was studying. She was at the Wharton School working on a Ph.D. in risk and insurance and finance. And she was trying to figure out whether she wanted to go an applied track or a theoretical track. So I had written her some comments about that. She replied to me about 24 hours before death, saying that she couldn't sleep and she'd been up studying. But then, to quote her, she said, "Thank you so much for the long, thoughtful email yesterday morning." Then, after responding to specific elements of my email, she wrote, quote, "It's back to work for me, but thanks again for the awesome email. I am excited for the work we will do together this summer. Love, Shannon." I will always be thankful for the wonderful relationship we had and that we parted on the best of terms. Around 2 a.m. on the morning of the 7th of May, her next door neighbor, she lived in a house that had been converted into apartments. Neighbor across the hall heard her scream for help, called 911. The police responded. There were 2 officers standing at her door in approximately 6 minutes. They knocked on the door. There was no response. They turned to the neighbor and said, "There's nobody home." There was a bit of back and forth, and the officers told them, "Well, we can't go around the city not kicking in doors." And they left. They were on the scene for 5 minutes. The next afternoon, our next day at noon, our son was passing through Philadelphia. Our son, Sean, and he and Shannon were to have lunch. When she didn't show up, he went over to her apartment. This was before the era of cell phones. So he wanted to talk to his mom, to Vicki, about what he should do. One of the things of note, Shannon had a sliding glass door. She was on a second floor apartment. There was a tree next to it. It was wrapped in barbed wire. We didn't think anybody could ever get up on that patio landing. But the house next door was only about 3 feet away, and he managed to crab walk up between the 2 houses, grabbed hold of her of the railing on the patio, and managed to get on the patio. She had been up studying. She was in the bathroom running bath water. Her patio door was slightly ajar, but the screen door was locked. He managed to pry that open and got into the house and grabbed her. The next day, or when the police came that night, They shined their flashlights up on the patio door. It was closed. When Sean got there the next day, it was wide open. So it's almost certain the assailant was there when the police were there. So Sean was there the next afternoon around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He managed to get one of the neighbors to come down and let him into the building. They went up, pushed open her door. She was laying naked, dead on her bed. 2 nights later, Vicki and I were at Mass. She was killed early on a Thursday morning, so Saturday evening we were at Mass. Our pastor, assistant pastor, had told the congregation what had happened and asked people to pray for us. We were proceeding through the Mass about as normally as you might proceed through the Mass at that juncture. And at the Lord's Prayer, when we got to forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, I lost my voice. I couldn't say that out loud. But I almost immediately began to understand what being a Christian was about in a much more deep way than I had ever realized in my life. Shortly after the Mass that evening, our pastor and assistant pastor came over, and as we sat there talking, Vicki began to articulate that we had been raised with the understanding that we needed to be forgiving people. We had not talked about this together at that juncture, but it was clear we were both thinking about the same thing. As we were about to approach to follow Shannon's casket up the funeral the following Tuesday, we were approached by 2 men in trench coats who happened to be homicide detectives from the Philadelphia Police Department. They told us that they thought that the man that had killed Shannon was in the church there. They later, at a reception after the burial, actually identified the fellow to me, not that he knew that they were identifying him. 2 days later, after the funeral, as we were emptying Shannon's apartment, there were 2 other detectives there, and they confirmed that they were absolutely sure that this was the guy that had killed Shannon. A couple of weeks later, as they had compiled evidence, they brought him in for questioning. He failed the lie detector test. The sergeant that was overseeing the investigation at that point called me and told me they were pretty certain they had their guy. The problem was he failed the DNA test. So we kind of came to a stark realization all of a sudden that had it not been for the DNA, there might have been somebody held in custody and possibly tried for Shannon's death who had nothing to do with it. So that was kind of the beginning of our understanding of what was going on. When we met the 2 detectives as we were cleaning out her apartment, they told us that this almost certainly was going to be a first-degree murder case. And they explained that there were 2 possible penalties: life in prison without parole or death if the assailant was found guilty. And they hinted very clearly that death was option number 1. We decided fairly quickly that we didn't want to be party to any of that. Early on, we were caught up. They told us they thought it was an acquaintance attack, that there was some kind of relationship that had run afoul, and that's why she was killed. The evidence that there was a relationship of some sort was that she had 2 toothbrushes in her bathroom. So when you watch CSI stories, often there's a little bit of evidence that leads to a big discovery, but this was not the big discovery that they were expecting. We spent the first couple of months, or 3 or 4 months, giving them names of people that she knew that they could test DNA. But finally, as things were beginning to settle down, we told one of the detectives in October that we would not support a death penalty, and if they intended to pursue a death penalty when they caught caught the fellow, we would publicly oppose it. We were told we should not disclose this to anyone because it could conceivably somehow complicate the homicide investigation and might ultimately also complicate the prosecution. Some months after that, it may have been 3 or 4, in a meeting with the lead prosecutor in the DA's office who handled first-degree homicides, his special assistant, a special assistant to the police chief, and a couple of the folks working on the investigation came to meet with us to tell us that we absolutely should not let this get out, and they hoped that we would change our minds in terms of opposing the death penalty, and again reiterated that this could complicate the homicide investigation and the actual prosecution. In January of 1999, so this is now 8 or 9 months later, they made a DNA linkage to 2 prior sexual assaults that had happened within 4 or 5 blocks of Shannon's apartment in the 8 or 9 months prior to his attacking Shannon. So all of a sudden we went from looking at a possible acquaintance to now somebody who was serially attacking women. It would be a year later, 18 months after Shannon was dead, in October of 1999, it was not the police, but reporters at the Philadelphia Inquirer who discovered that there were another 2 earlier cases that the Philadelphia police had classified as non-crimes in their police records. One of these women was attacked. She was so badly injured, she was in the hospital for 2 days. She could not recall what happened. They told us later that they were pretty certain that she had been out drinking with her friends that night. She was drunk and had gotten in a fight with a boyfriend or somebody, and that because she was drunk, she couldn't recall what happened. They classified her case as a non-crime. The other woman, they didn't even investigate the scene. She sat down and wrote out a report of what happened. She dug through her bed and taped 12 hairs to this yellow sheet of paper about what happened. She took it to the police and turned it in. It was not processed until the fall of 1999, more than 2 years after the attack actually took place. Major scandal in the city at that time. And ultimately, the police commissioner insisted that they do an audit of reported sexual assaults over the prior 3 years that had been classified as non-crimes. They reopened 2,000 cases, and based on evidence they had in their files, they reclassified over 60% of them, over 1,200 cases, as felony assaults. It was open season on women in Philadelphia. Shortly in August, in Labor Day weekend of '99, there was another attack in the area, and it turned out DNA matched. But then the trail went cold. In early 2001, or in the spring-summer of 2001, there were a series of attacks began in Fort Collins, Colorado. And the police force in Fort Collins caught on fairly quickly that they had a serial assailant working in their community. Now, mind you, Philadelphia Police Department had around 5,000 officers. The Fort Collins Police Department had about 150 officers. The Fort Collins Police, where Colorado State is located, put out an all-points bulletin to police agencies across the country. Someone at the Philadelphia department picked it up and sent DNA from Shannon's case to Colorado. And there were 2 cops, two officers on a airplane the morning of 9/11, 2001, about to fly to Colorado to have a press conference that they had DNA linkages in attacks in these two cities. Their plane was grounded that morning because of the attacks going on around the country. But a week later, they made the announcement. Ultimately, they did not capture the fellow until April the 23rd of 2002. By the time they captured him out there were either 8 actual assaults or attempted assaults. So six in Philadelphia, 8 in Colorado that we know of, or they're formally registered. There's evidence that there were additional attacks that had not gotten reported. There was only one murder. It was the only instance where the police were called during the assault. Once they caught the fellow in Philadelphia, the big news was not so much that they caught him, but that Schiebers were going to oppose the death penalty. The district attorney in Philadelphia at that point in time was Lynn Abraham, who was known as one of the deadliest DAs in the country. She was known as the Queen of Death. After the story broke of our opposition, she held a press conference and said that the death penalty was the appropriate penalty in this case, and that's the penalty they were going to pursue. It didn't make any difference what we thought or we hoped. The lawyers in Colorado signaled fairly quickly. There was DNA evidence in all 6 of the cases in Philadelphia. They had DNA in 4 of the cases in Colorado. They had fingerprints in the other cases. The evidence was extremely solid of what was going on. The attorney out there signaled that the assailant was willing to plead guilty to all of these cases, including Shannon's murder, if he did not face a death penalty prosecution. So we kind of had this situation on the board. Michael Smerconish, some of you who watch CNN on Saturday mornings may know of Michael Smerconish. At the time this was all going on, he had a radio talk show in Philadelphia. He was a editorial writer for the Philadelphia Daily News, wrote an open letter to us and about our position. And I'm going to quote from that. Your opinion that Mr. Graves should not be put to death raises an interesting question. What weight should be given to your sentiment? I believe strongly in victims' rights, and for that reason, I believe ample weight should be given to your opinion. However, I do not believe that any of citizens' feelings should determine that decision, even if that citizen is the victim. That would result in disparate sentencing in society. The assailant, I don't use his name usually, if guilty, committed a murderous act against society, and society's interests must be paramount. Society's interests require serious consideration of a death sentence. We must never want another promising young woman to have her life cut short by a murderous thug, and we must consider the deterrence that a death sentence in this case might provide. The Daily News was very gracious and allowed us to provide a lengthy response. We started off talking about the basis of our opinion being our faith, but we also pointed to the racial disparities, to the economic disparities, and how this death penalty was applied. And we pointed out that if the DA and the police were really worried about the safety of young women in Philadelphia, they would probably serve them better if they cleaned up their police department than instead of killing somebody that was going to be in prison for the rest of his life. Anyway, if you want a copy of that letter, I can provide it to the Professor Gurley. It was an interesting public fight to have. I want to make 2 points about the letter. The first is that there's a very small set of prosecutors who account for a disproportionate set of death sentence cases. And if you've not seen the Harvard Law Project's fair punishment report, the worst of the worst, released in 2016. It's extremely enlightening. In the introduction of that report, they quoted a DA from Caddo Parish in Louisiana. The report was actually not about him as being one of the worst, but he gave a comment that I think kind of sets what goes through these people's minds. This DA, Dale Cox, said, "I think we need to kill more people. Revenge brings us a visceral satisfaction." In this report, they described the top five prosecutors in the country. Number one, Joe Freeman Britt was a DA in Robeson County, North Carolina from 1974 to 1988, and he personally prosecuted 38 death sentence cases, 38 cases where he was awarded a death sentence in the trial. He is quoted in this report as saying, quote, "Within the breast of each of us burns a flame that constantly whispers in our ear, preserve life, preserve life, preserve life at any cost. It's the prosecutor's job to extinguish that flame." Misconduct was alleged in 81.6% of those 38 cases and was successfully found in 36.8% of them. The next guy is Cowboy Bob Macy, DA in Oklahoma County, Oklahoma from 1980 to 2001. He sent more people to death row than any other individual DA in the country. He was personally responsible for 54 death sentences. Donald Myers, known as Dr. Death, serves as the chief prosecutor of the 11th Judicial District of South Carolina from 1977 till 2017. He personally prosecuted 39 cases ending in death sentences. The U.S. Attorney for the District of South Carolina said of Myers, quote, "The only reason he gets up in the morning is to try death penalty cases. Virtually the only time you see him in the courtroom is when he is trying to kill people," unquote. Misconduct alleged in 61.5% of his death penalty cases and found in 46.2% of them. Lynn Abraham, our antagonist, was number 4 on the list. She during her tenure as DA, is about 3 or 4 months short of 20 years, there were 108 individuals sentenced to death from her jurisdiction. She was different than these other DAs. She didn't do the dirty work herself. She had the prosecutors in her office do the work. During her tenure, the death sentences coming out of her jurisdiction accounted for more than 51% of all of the death sentences handed down in all of the state of Pennsylvania. So about 11% of the population, 51% of the death sentences. If these were not people who were called prosecutors, it seems to me that a lot of people might think they were psychopaths. You just think the appetite they had for killing people. In every instance where these individuals left their posts of chief prosecutors in their districts, the rate of death sentences prosecutions dropped precipitously. In Philadelphia today, the prosecutor, the district attorney, is committed to never using the death penalty. Does this variation that we see across these communities, does it vary because of social norms in the community, or does it vary because of the appetite of the people that are overseeing the prosecutions themselves? And it's not just limited to this handful of counties. In 85% of the U.S. counties, there have been no death penalty convictions since the reintroduction of the death penalty in 1977. From January 2015 through April of 2020, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, and Missouri accounted for 83% of the executions in the country. Shannon was murdered by a serial rapist who had attacked 4 other women within 10 blocks of her apartment in the prior 11 months. 2 cases, including the one where the woman was so badly injured she was hospitalized, were classified as non-crimes by the police department. During the homicide investigation, the press would uncover the far more widespread application or problem with downgrading of these crimes. This is also another policing problem that was not localized or restricted purely to Philadelphia. This kind of behavior has been uncovered at least twice in Baltimore, at least 3 times in New York City, at least 2 times in Cleveland. It's gone on for years in Memphis. In Detroit, they discovered over 12,000 untested rape kits. When they finally tested, you might think that all of this stuff is localized, so we don't need to worry about it. When they finally tested the rape kits in Detroit and plugged them into the FBI's CODIS database, they found out that the people that they added to the CODIS database were linked to felony assaults in 40 other states, representing 94% of the population. What happens in Detroit certainly didn't stay in Detroit. What happened in Philadelphia with the guy that killed Shannon certainly didn't stay in Philadelphia. By the way, when they finally caught him, he was married. He was in the Air Force. He was a missile technician. He had a top secret clearance. So you never quite know who your neighbor might be. The lead detective in Shannon's homicide investigation recently stated on a national television program that if the prior crimes in Philadelphia had been properly classified and investigated, he was 100% sure that Shannon Schieber would be alive today. Now, he wasn't taking into account the other contingencies in the life table, but he was clearly saying that what they were doing in terms of how they were handling these cases was at the fault of her death. Not one officer in that sex crimes unit lost their job, lost rank, lost a day's pay because of what they were doing. But they were willing to kill this guy who could not hurt anyone else once he was captured. Mr. Smerconich was wrong about what would make Philadelphia safer. It would be safer not by killing that man, but by cleaning up their police department. The American philosopher Yogi Berra said you can observe a lot by watching. When Shannon was killed, the average time a murderer between a murder and carrying out the death sentence in death penalty in these cases was around 17 and a half years. Because of the moratoria that have been declared and problems with the active states getting the things they need to operate the machinery of death, that average time is now over 20 years. Shannon's assailant was captured on the 23rd day of April. He was sentenced for her murder on the 30th day of May in 2001. In 37 days, all of the criminal prosecution was done because we did not, we would not let them pursue a death penalty. The attorney in Colorado said, if you're going to go after death penalty in Philadelphia, we're going to fight the cases here as long as we can. It would have taken at least another year before they got him to Philadelphia. It would have taken a year before they got him to trial. He would still be on death row today in Pennsylvania had he been sentenced to death. In 37 days, we were done. If he was still alive, we'd be going through hearing after hearing after hearing. The death penalty doesn't necessarily serve the interests of the people that survive these horrible crimes. The politics of dealing with this are tough. One of the people we ran into in our travels, Vicki, a number of years ago, testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C. One of the members on that committee at that time was a senator from Kansas, Sam Brownback. Sam was a convert to Catholicism. He was so impressed with Vicki's testimony that he took a video home for his children to watch. So, and then he called us and he wanted us to come in and visit with him. His staff looking at this. After he left the Senate, he served 2 terms as governor in Kansas. We went to visit him in his office at least 3 times. We always had to start our meeting with a prayer, but we could never get Sam to stand up and fight for the end of the death penalty. There was one particular senator from the municipal area just across the state line in Kansas City. It was in the Shawnee Mission area, whose daughter had been murdered, and he was hell-bent that they were not going to eliminate the use of the death penalty in Kansas. Other than that, we were all over Kansas. We think that they had a good chance of getting rid of it, but Sam was not willing to stand up and fight for it. We were also all over Nebraska. We've been in 22 or 23 states on this trip. The legislature there in 2015 voted to eliminate the death penalty. They chose to do it on the basis of fiscal concerns, something I'm never too enthused about. We shouldn't be nickel and diming people to death or keeping them alive because of nickels and dimes. But the governor there, Pete Ricketts, another Catholic, vetoed the bill. The legislature overrode his veto, and he and his dad, Joe was the guy that started TD Ameritrade, so they got a few bucks in the bank. They own the Chicago Cubs, among other things. Pete and his dad put up $400,000 in a legislative effort. The initial contribution was 80% of the effort to gather signatures to get this on the ballot. They ended up spending 30% of the total funds spent to overturn this legislation, and the people of Colorado overturned the legislation in 2016. Until we got involved in all of this, I didn't understand the true meaning of wrath as a deadly sin. When we were testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee, probably in 2011 or 12, down in Annapolis, we met a couple who was on the other side of the issue, Fred and Betty Romano. Their daughter Dawn was murdered in 1987 by a fellow who was high on drugs. He murdered their daughter, murdered another woman in Maryland, and then went up to Maine and murdered a woman up in Maine. They caught him in Maine, tried him and sentenced him to life in prison, remanded him to Maryland, and he was sentenced to death. He was the second last person put to death in Maryland before they eliminated the death penalty in 2013. There was an article in the Washington Post, a front page article 2 or 3 days before that execution, about Fred and Betty Romano, Dawn's parents. And the article talked about what miserable shape these people were in, how their marriage was falling apart, how they had transferred as much of this burden as they could to their son because they couldn't stand it anymore, and it was now burdening him as well. They waited 17 years for this execution. Fred observed in this Washington Post article that he was convinced the family would have been better off if they just left the guy in Maine. Betty, who had been back to her doctor for the X plus whatever round of sedatives and what have you, that she needed to deal with all this, said of it beats you to death. This takes a hell of a toll on people. If Robert Enright, a professor at the University of Wisconsin, has done research for years on the burden of anger on the physical body. It stimulates things in the mind that set off all kinds of hormones in your body that literally just rip your body apart. Think about living with this for 17, 18, 20, 30 years. Bud Welch, whose daughter Julie was killed at the Oklahoma City bombing, decided after about a year that he didn't want to be involved in a death penalty sentence for Timothy McVeigh. He said that when they went to trial, only about 10% of the survivors of people who had been killed, the families, only about 10% of them were opposed to the death penalty. By the time it was carried out, 50% of them were opposed to it. And 10 years afterwards, there was hardly anybody who thought that the death penalty was the appropriate thing for them to do. This doesn't serve the interests. This doesn't serve the interests of survivors. It's a trap, and it's a poisonous trap. A number of years ago, we were involved in the development of a documentary, The Executioner's Shadow. You can find it on YouTube. And one of the people we met in the process there was a fellow named Jerry Givens. He served as the state of Virginia's chief executioner for 17 years. He presided over 62 executions. He said that the ones that really haunted him were the individuals who, in their last breath, before they pushed the button on the electric chair or he pushed the plunger, were the ones that in their last spoken moment said, "I didn't do this." Ultimately, they brought a fellow in. Name was Earl Washington. In Virginia at the time, they kept the death row prisoners out of Mecklenburg, which is in the kind of the southwest corner of the state. The death house was in Richmond, and they would bring them in 2 weeks before the execution. They brought Earl Washington in for his execution, and about 5 days before they were supposed to carry it out, the Department of Corrections people came in and took this guy out of the death house and never explained to the staff who was supposed to preside over his death what happened. Why? He later found out that the guy had been totally exonerated. And he realized that he almost had done what he had been putting people to death for. He had almost almost murdered an innocent man. Most people don't realize that the cause of death on the death certificate when someone is executed is homicide. He said, "I almost committed an unwarranted homicide." And he said, "This is not something that the public has a right to expect of its civil servants." Several years ago, Tom Wolf, the governor in Pennsylvania, was struggling with whether or not he wanted to have a moratorium on the death penalty. And he called together a group of people in an off-the-record meeting, all sworn to secrecy. And Vicki and I were included in that. We were the only two people who did not reside in Pennsylvania. We reside in Maryland, but our daughter was killed in Pennsylvania. There were about 20 people around this big table. There were 3 of us who opposed the death penalty. All the others had had a loved one killed, and they were waiting for someone to be executed because of that murder. And there were stories about 15, 20, 30 years of waiting. And then a few days after this meeting, Governor Wolf did proclaim a moratorium. All of those prisoners, unless they died naturally, are still on Pennsylvania's death row. When we got all done with that meeting, there were a small handful of us sat around and we were just chatting about our experience, our relative experiences in this wonderful group that we now belong to. And
there was no animosity between those of us on different points in this. And as we were getting all done and kind of winding up to say goodbye to each other, one of the guys looked at me and he says, "Boy, I really wish I was where you are. It is a trap. It does not serve the interest. It does not serve the interest of survivors. It simply extends the burden that they have to bear." There are many other stories I could tell you. It's been a long, interesting journey in some regards. Couple of concluding observations. We have never met anyone 15 or 20 or 30 years down the path of waiting for somebody else to be killed who has explained that this has been a happy journey for them. It's a hard journey. We have never met anyone else who's made the transition from hating this person to letting go of that anger and moving on with their own lives, who told us they regretted making the decision that they made. It's much better for us as surviving human beings to let go of that anger and to move on. For me, the Lord's Prayer was a tremendous gift. It was the key to sanity, the key to being able to move on in life. Christ putting the phrase, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those," in the Lord's Prayer, it was not a hard challenge, it was a gift. There's another story in the Gospel of St. John that I think is also important. We didn't recognize this until after we got into the situation we're in. In the Gospel story about the scribes and Pharisees presenting the woman about to be stoned, Christ did not ask them about the evidence against the woman or the injury to other people. He didn't respond to the question about his thinking regarding the law calling for execution. He simply turned to the would-be executioners and said, "You without sin should cast the first stone." And they all had to walk away. I have never heard that gospel, and we go to church regularly. That gospel only comes around probably every 3 years, but I have never heard a homily around that gospel discuss this story in the context of the death penalty. But for us, so that's what this is about. Christ was making a pretty profound statement about what he thought about executions. So if we want to call ourselves Christians, then it seems to me we have to kind of buy into the program. A number of years ago, after we completed our trial, we were out in Colorado. We met all of the young women out there who had been attacked, and there was a contribution, and anyway, the press was there, and this one reporter just came on very aggressively about how we could possibly have made the decision to fight the death penalty with the guy that had killed our daughter. And he wouldn't let go and wouldn't let go and wouldn't let go. I was focusing primarily on our what I call our Christian values. And finally, I just turned to him and it just came to me. If you can't stand by your principles when it's difficult, then they're not your principles. So, there's a lot of people, governors, legislators, who profess to be Christians. I think the work that you have to do here in the university, where you're beginning to bring this to people's understanding, we're not hearing it. We haven't been hearing it from the pulpit. Somehow we need to tell people if they want to be part of this club, there's certain things that they need to do. And one of them they need to do is to end the use of the death penalty. Thank you. clean this up later.
Good time, so, Syl and I sit here and open up for questions from the audience, so, I'm gonna ask Ann to, if you have a question, raise your hand, we'll bring the mic up to you, and we'll proceed. So don't be shy.
There's one in the back. Get your exercise today.
That's right.
I was just curious where we could start locally to help with this in this regard. I understand that it's just how we can get started locally helping with getting rid of the death penalty. I mean, as somebody who hasn't done much of it in that way so far.
Indiana has renewed use of the death penalty recently. You also have the uncomfortable benefit of having the federal execution house here in your state. There are groups in each of the states that work with legislators and so forth to end the use of the death penalty. In Washington, D.C., a group we've been associated with, I don't know, 15 years, 16 years, however long it's existed now, the Catholic Mobilizing Network, has significant materials and support that they can make available to you in these efforts. If you would like to be introduced to those people, just walk down 2 rows. The executive director and head of the folks there that interact with universities are sitting right in front of you. So I would advise you also talk to them.
Just add that, as Syl was saying, in July of 2024, the governor, then Governor Holcomb, lifted the moratorium on the death penalty for Indiana. And a group of us here on campus got together and drafted a letter to the governor opposing the decision to lift the death penalty, to reinstate the moratorium on the death penalty, to reinstate the death penalty. And we got about, I don't know, 20, I think about 25, faculty members, university to sign the letter, submitted it to the governor, and never heard back. Never received a response. Not even a thank you, but no thanks. Just ignored. It was just ignored. We made sure, we sent it in, we emailed a copy, we sent a hard copy, and there was just no response. And then in December, in fact, I think it was a week before Christmas, and there was the first execution in Indiana after about 15 years because of the moratorium.
Understood that he wanted. He's been on death row for quite a long time, and his lawyer tried to,
Well, I recently had the opportunity to run into Anthony Ray Hinton, who spent 31 years, I guess, on death row in Alabama. He was ultimately fully exonerated. He explained to me that during his tenure there, he was right close to the death chamber, so he got to see them bring people by as they were going to have their last visit. I think he said there were 52 people executed. He said there were 20 some who committed suicide. If people want to take their own lives, I'm certainly not encouraging that. That's their business. But if somebody walked up to you in the street and said, I really don't want to be here anymore, here's a gun, would you please shoot me? You wouldn't do it. Now, people do some bad, again, Anthony Ray, he said, one of the things most people don't realize, he said, most of these people actually do have consciences. And at some juncture, as you're going down the line, they wake up to what it was that they did. And there's actually remorse and redemption. And that's part of the reason why you want to try and keep people alive. And if somebody decides that, you know, they're so miserable that they want to take their own life, maybe what they need is counseling, and not a shot in the arm that puts them to death. You know, it is not our obligation to be murdering people. And we ought not to take that obligation on simply because we have this system that is a wrongful system.
I would just add, you know, we had a speaker here yesterday who was on death row, Vermont Hunter. He was on death row for several years. I don't recall the exact number of 13 years, I believe, could have been a little longer. But he talked about that experience. And he talked about the horrific emotional, physical, mental toll that it took on him. You know, every day, you know, first of all, knowing that he was innocent, but despite his innocence, being condemned to death for a crime he didn't commit, and just the emotional toll that it took on him. And therefore, you really wonder if someone could get to that point and say, I can't take it any longer. I want it to end. I cannot endure this suffering. And of course, you know, he's on death row. He's in a cell, you know, 23 hours a day. And I could see someone getting to that point and saying, I've suffered enough. I can't endure this anymore. I want the suffering to end. I want my life to end. But again, you know, is that person suffering from some type of severe depression and mental illness that is contributing to this decision, you know, that he's making to have his life ended? So I think it's complicated. I think it's complicated, and there are a lot of dimensions and nuances to that decision, that perspective, that point of view.
Okay. They need to hear you for the recording.
For the people that you met that were families of victims, what would you say is like the biggest reason that they didn't turn against the death penalty? Was it because of that waiting period, or they had other concerns?
I think in many cases they just understand the futility. And I mentioned Bud Welch. His daughter Julie was killed in the Oklahoma City bombing. He was drinking heavily, he called it self-medicating, smoking heavily. He's lost his wife. He lost his business. And he said that Julie came to him one night in a dream and said, you know, Dad, he killed me, and why are you letting him kill you as well? You know, a month after Shannon died, you may remember, some of you might not be old enough, there was a notorious case down in Texas. 3 guys chained a black fellow behind a pickup and drug him down the road. There were 2 of those 3 were sentenced to death. That's last death penalty was carried out in 2019. By then, the victim's son, the man who'd been his son, was openly opposed to the death penalty. It's a horrible, horrible trap. I mean, if you meet people from time to time who seem to be consumed by anger, and there's a tension within these people, and this just brings out the very worst part of it. It's inhumane. It's inhumane to the survivors. And what people need is help. And I think one of the problems is that if you live in one of these jurisdictions where you have one of these mad dogs that wants to put people to death, you know, if you grab folk in that first moment of anger and emotion, they're almost certainly going to go along with what it is you're suggesting. And once they've got you, it's hard to break that bond, because now you have to go out and make a really strong public statement. And it seems like we've been accused of not loving our daughter. In presentations like this, people get up. You can't possibly. All you're looking for is publicity for yourselves and so forth. You can go do a Google on me. I don't need this for publicity. You know, I think it's a trap. And most people don't begin to understand what kind of a trap it is in the heat of the moment. And if somehow in these jurisdictions, you could put together a SWAT team that would go in and you know, help calm people down and help them deal with the crisis they're dealing with, and settle down and explain, you know, I talk about Yogi Bear, you know, he's just, when you come to a fork in the road, take it, you know, help them get the right lane. Because if you get caught on this other lane, it's just not, it's not good for anybody.
There was a study that was performed by two professors, Armour and Umbright, and it's titled Assessing the Impact of the Ultimate Penal Sanction on Homicide Survivors, a two-state comparison. And it was published in the Marquette Law Review in 2012. And it was a pilot study comparing Texas survivors' reaction when murders were sentenced to death with Minnesota survivors' reaction when murders were sentenced to the maximum penalty in that state of life without the possibility of parole. And so we've got Texas, you know, looking at the survivors. They're pursuing the death penalty. In Minnesota, instead, they were satisfied with the life without possibility of parole. And what they found was that the Minnesota survivors displayed, quote, higher levels of physical, psychological, and behavioral health, end quote, during the post-conviction period because they felt a greater sense of control over the process. In Minnesota, survivors had greater control, likely because the appeals process was successful, predictable, and completed within 2 years after conviction, whereas the finality of the appeals process in Texas was drawn out, elusive, delayed, unpredictable. It generated layers of injustice, powerlessness, and in some instances, despair. Although the grief and depth of sorrow remained high for Minnesotans, no longer having to deal with the murderer, his outcome or the criminal justice system allowed survivors control and energy to be put into the present, to be used for personal healing rather than focus on the assailant. And so kind of an interesting, you know, study and findings as a result. Yes.
I was just wondering what you thought about the powerful historical impact of the phrase an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which I looked up on my phone here and actually is from Exodus 21. And then this entry also says that the earliest known use of this principle appears in the Code of Hammurabi. So what we have there then is centuries, in fact, thousands of years of this idea of reciprocal justice.
Some people consider the Bible the revealed word of God. The Code of Hammurabi was written about 1,200 years before Exodus was by a pagan king. Now that's an interesting way for God to reveal His enlightened way for us to live. First of all, Mahatma Gandhi said, "If you follow the path of an eye for eye, you're going to end up with a lot of blind people." You know, if you go to Matthew, part of what Christ was about is a new law, and the new law is turn the cheek. The old law is eye for an eye. Although if you look through the Old Testament, you can find quite a number of passages that suggest we shouldn't be killing each other. But we've danced with the eye for an eye many times. It's the old law, and so. But it's almost word for word from the Code of Hammurabi. That if you actually read, excuse me, if you read through that whole passage, there's kind of this litany of reasons you can kill. if your children curse you, you can kill them. If they slap you, you can kill them. You know, we haven't followed, we only focus on that one passage. So it's, if you want to follow it, it's a lot more than that one passage, and it's pretty severe. I don't think most people would embrace it, even in Texas. But I had a very good friend who's passed away, was from Dallas, born and raised in Dallas. He says, you can always tell a Texan, but you can't tell him much. So.
Any other questions? I have maybe one last question. Is there a question? Good.
Run.
I'm gonna say-
Take your time. Thank you. I'm trying to convince my wife of that.
As you express, it's a trap, right? So that's just a whole different way of looking at it. I'm just curious what your work has been with Brian Stevenson, and if you join efforts with what he's doing, because the way he presents it is really of that, you know, of the legal perspective of you know, condemning people to death who are innocent as well. And so I was just wondering what the collaboration has been with that work.
Well, the Catholic Mobilizing Network, which we have sponsored, you're sitting right next to Chris Ann Valancourt Murphy. She takes a variety of people down to Brian Stevenson's front yard regularly for retreats. And he comes and speaks with them, or his people come and speak for them quite regularly. I have not had any direct contact with Brian. You know, I am neither Vicki nor I are attorneys. We're not amateur attorneys. We are not lawyers. You know, I think part of what I was trying to say is we've come across people that are involved in this at various stages. You know, the prosecutors, the guy actually pushing it, you know, Jerry Gibbons said actually killing people, electrocuting them was much easier for the executioner than the you know, giving them the tranquilizers. He said, you know, when you were executing, all you did was push the button, and the electricity fried them. Here you're sitting here with 7 different syringes that you have to squirt into their arm, and you see it, you see what you're doing. But you know, I think each of the points we've looked at and been in touch with, the answer keeps coming back: don't do it. And there's slightly different nuances in how you get to the don't do it, but it's a consistent answer. And that's what I think is really important.
Go ahead, Lenore.
Perpetrator of a murder of one of their relatives executed, and afterwards kind of joined your side and regretted.
Well, personally, but the Bud Welsh story is pretty compelling. That, you know, shortly after 10% were opposed, by the death penalty being carried out, 50%, and 10 years later, 98% or whatever. If you go back, if you recall the Timothy McVeigh execution, there were so many people that they couldn't all get them into the viewing room, so they had a separate closed circuit TV. And after the execution, people came out in the press, where the press always is, sitting there grabbing people at their most vulnerable moment. And the people were generally quite aggravated, at least the ones that ended up in the TV interviews, that it was first of all, he came in, they put him on the gurney, he got up on one elbow, and he looked at the people and he sneered, and that made them angry. And then it was too easy. It was too easy. So, you know, I haven't actually talked to anyone 10 years after an execution about it, but I've seen the stories. You know, the guy in Texas dragged behind his son. We've met Dave Kaczynski, the Unabomber's brother, who turned his brother in. He turned his brother in on the condition that they not pursue the death penalty against him. And then the first thing they did is started talking about pursuing the death penalty. And this poor guy was, oh my God, I turned my brother. They ultimately backed off on that. We met Robbie Meerpole, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's youngest son, you know, who had to grow up without parents. We've met some extremely interesting folks, but I've never not personally met somebody 10 years after or 5 years after an execution to see how. But I know there's no closure. I mean, the guy that killed Shannon, for all practical purposes, is immaterial to us right now. But Shannon is still material to us. The day she died, part of us died. You know, and there's nothing going to heal that hole in our heart. Now it's like any injury. There's a scar develops. As a woodworker, I carve at times, and I once cut this finger almost to the bone, and there's a scar here. But when I rub it, I can still feel that, you know, there's still that. You learn to live with the scar, but the injury is not totally gone. And so this idea that somehow killing this guy is going to fix that, there's no way it can touch that. The way you touch that is you try to figure out how to do good for something good because of what you've lost. Try to make something positive out of the hole in your heart.
You said something yesterday when you were speaking to our class after class. I thought it was profound. You said that if you have a platform, use it. You know, if you have a forum, use it. So, could you comment on that?
Well, who was it? You should never waste a tragedy. Who said that? You should never waste a tragedy. You should learn from what happened, the mistake, and try to help other people understand what happened so they can avoid the traps. I just can't. If you ever get the chance and want to have a miserable day, find somebody that's 10 or 15 or 20 years into waiting for an execution and sit down and have a chat with them about the path they're on. I've never met a single one who described this as a joyful walk. It is not. And you know, those people deserve our sympathy and they deserve a hug. And you know, by the time they get 20 years down the road, they can't go back and undo what they've done. But you know, I don't know. We didn't. We belong to a parish in Frederick, Maryland. It's the oldest parish and the oldest archdiocese in the country. So it's a very historic parish. The church was built in 1837 after Vatican II, when everybody was throwing away their statues and things. They were renovating the church and decided to take the stained glass windows out, and which was a pity in this beautiful church. And so recently they decided to reinstall stained glass windows, and they got used stained glass windows out of a church that had been decommissioned in Pennsylvania, of all places. And we actually, they were soliciting people to help pay for the windows, and we actually paid for one of the windows in memory of Shannon. And as we were talking to our pastor, I'd never thought about it in this context. he said that we really should be thanking the Holy Spirit, because we had been given voice because of our experience, and the Holy Spirit was all about giving people the tongue. And you know, if you've got a special gift, and sometimes gifts are not always really grand things, but if you've got a special gift, you should use it. You shouldn't waste a tragedy. Shannon would have been horribly disappointed if we made nothing of what happened to her. And so, you know, those of you in law school here, you're developing special tools, special personal tools. If you think this is an important issue, you should figure out how to use your voice. Again, somehow, when you go home and talk to your pastor, go look at I think it's chapter 8 in St. John's Gospel. Get out that gospel and tell him what this gospel's all about, because they certainly aren't teaching it in the seminary. And somebody needs to. I at least have our pastor and assistant pastor understanding. The next time that comes around, if they don't mention the death penalty, I'm going to get up and walk out. But
Well, I just want to say that everyone here in this room, we're so thankful for you and Vicki taking this horrible, tragic experience and finding the moral courage and strength to turn this into a positive, and to use that experience over the last 25 plus years to educate all of us, to educate so many people. I'm sure you've touched literally thousands and thousands of people and have educated them on the death penalty and the reasons why it should be abolished. And you've made a difference. You've made an incredible difference and impact. And we're very grateful for your efforts. We're very grateful for your grace. And we're very grateful for you to being with us here today. And so before we end, I do want to give thanks to the co-sponsors of this event, which I should have done at the beginning. But in particular, I want to highlight the co-sponsor support by the Clow Institute for Civil and Human Rights. Professor McAward was here and left just a few moments ago. And then the several student organizations that have co-sponsored the event, including the Black Law Students Association, the American Civil Liberties Union, Notre Dame, the Notre Dame Exoneration Project, and the Death Penalty Abolition Society, because we couldn't have done this without your support. So we're very appreciative. And let's just give one more thanks and appreciation.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you.